Hey guys, welcome to the Helicopter Podcast. I'm your guy, Halsey Schider, and big shout out and thanks to MHM Publishing for creating such an amazing platform, the Vertical HeliCAST platform for everything helicopter podcasting. You got my podcast. You have The Real Rescue with Jason Quinn, aka Quinny. You have the new Vertical MRO with our guy Val, and of course we have our guest today joining us from the Hangar Z Podcast, Jon Gray. He's like the OG, the original gangster for the HeliCAST platform. He is the guy that started it all. Jon, I just started recording. How does this make you feel?
I'm a little uncomfortable. You know, to be honest, I don't know how this got past my agent. We didn't agree to this. But good morning. How's it going?
It's good, man. So Jon and I have wildly different styles in podcasting or setups. By and large, I'm more of a free flow, kind of just
laissez-faire.
Start recording. I don't really plan questions unless I'm forced to. And I just start talking. Where I know that, Jon, you're a little bit more pre-planned, right?
Yeah, I spend time drawing up an outline and doing some research and kind of plotting a course for the conversation. And I like your style. I mean, you do a really good job of hosting the conversation. Not as good of a job as the Hangar Z, of course, but it's a close second, maybe third or fourth. But, you know, yeah. I appreciate you.
Hey, man, we can't all be awesome. You know, just trying my best over here. Jon, it's great to have you on the show. We've actually had you on before. I think it was for the 50th episode where it was kind of a podcast takeover. You came on the show and you served as the host and you interviewed me, and which was super fun. And I really enjoyed that, obviously. But I kind of realized that, hey, we hadn't actually talked to you and introduced my audience fully to you and your helicopter background, specifically in the public safety, flying for the police. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn more about that. We actually haven't had too many law enforcement guys or gals on the show. I think, kind of going off the top of my head, I think we've had one guy, I think Brad Isaacs, I want to say, started off in law enforcement, but then ended up going to utility.
Yep. You had Jack?
Well, of course. Of course, Jack Shanley. Duh.
The Jack Shanley.
Forget. Jack, I'm sorry. We had the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jack Shanley. It's very hard to say his last name because his famous relative here in Portland was Shanley, but they have different pronunciations. Makes no sense to me. But yes, Jack was great. I love Jack. So cool that Jack actually lives in my hometown. I have to look up producer Zach. If you want to text me the episode that Jack and I shared, I can make sure that I plug it to get on this show because it was so fun having Jack on the show. I want to talk about your helicopter stuff. I want to obviously dive into that. I want to learn more about what it's like getting into law enforcement, flying law enforcement. But I'm actually curious to talk a little bit more about your podcast right now and learn more about the Hangar Z Podcast and what made you start it. Why do you continue to do it? And what has the show become compared to when you started?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to sit here and talk about it in 2024 because this all started back in 2020. And had you asked me in 2019 if I'd ever be in a position where I'd start a podcast, I would have probably laughed in your face. You know, I was primarily just a consumer of podcasts. There was one in particular that I started listening to called the Team Never Quit podcast. It's with Marcus Luttrell and you know, a bunch of Navy SEALs, and they talk about adversity and overcoming adversity. And I always really inspired by those podcasts. So my drive to work was about an hour each way, give or take. Southern California traffic's always fun. So I consumed podcasts during that time to try and, you know, not just check out on the drive, but to try and be productive during a drive and, you know, learn something or gain some insight. So I listened to podcasts. And that Team Never Quit podcast was like the launching point for me, where I started exploring other podcasts. Eventually I came across the Pilot's Lounge podcast, which is with our friends from Brotalion. And of course it's all Army aviation and pretty broad aviation topics they talk about. But they had a conversation with an LA County sheriff's deputy who is a pilot in their search and rescue helicopter. And I was really interested hearing that conversation. And after I heard that, I'm like, there's got to be more of this content somewhere. There's aviation podcasts everywhere. So I did a deep dive and couldn't come across anything that was related to public safety aviation. So I'm like, you know what? It's 2020. I've got extra time on my hands. Let's see if I can just do this on my own. So I borrowed a microphone from a friend and had an old laptop that my dad had given me from years before, and did a little bit of research, and just it worked out. So it's been pretty awesome.
Yeah, man. I mean, you've done a fantastic job. In fact, I've been mistaken for the Hangar Z a couple times now. I've had to disappoint people in email correspondence that I'm not the Hangar Z podcast, but obviously you've made an impact and you've done some really cool things. And one thing that I've actually never talked to you about, and I meant to ask you recently, and then I totally forgot, the Hangar Z. What is the Hangar Z?
So I flew for Ontario Police Department in Southern California. It's a kind of a bedroom community about, 30 miles east of Los Angeles. And we flew out of Cable Airport, and our hangar was Hangar Z at Cable Airport. So that's the short of the story. There's a longer, in-depth conversation that goes with that, but really not an original name, I guess, if I'm to be honest. It's, we flew out of Hangar Z, or the last hangar in the row of hangars at Cable Airport. So right off the departure end. And that was become the name. And I'll be at the hangar for something, and I'll be standing outside the door, and it has the Z on it. And I'll see people look at me and look at that, and like, I get it now. It makes sense. So
yeah, I think I actually saw maybe a Facebook post recently, and there's some helicopters coming in and out of that hangar. And I was like, oh, maybe I guess it's Hangar Z. Yeah. But then I meant to ask you, and then I spaced it. One of the cool things with Jon, obviously you have Jack. Is Jack full-time on the Hangar Z now? How is that working?
So Jack and Jeff are our two primary co-hosts and hosts. So we've got a total cadre, I guess you could call it, of 9 co-hosts. What we've tried to do is identify people with different skill sets to talk about these different mission sets that take place in public safety aviation, because there's so much to know and so many different mission sets. I like to bring an expert in those different scenarios to talk to the guests that we're interviewing about whatever that thing is. But Jack and Jeff, they're kind of a jack of all trades. And, Jack is a wealth of expertise. He's been training in the law enforcement aviation industry for a long time. So to have him on the podcast really brings a really high level of just unique conversation to the podcast. And then Jeff as well, not only was he a pilot, or is a pilot in law enforcement, he was also a mechanic with the Army, with the National Guard, and then flew him. So he has a pretty varied background in aviation as well. So picking up the two of them has been awesome. Jeff started with us, gosh, it was like within the first 6 months of the podcast starting. And, it's been awesome working with him and following him through his career path. He left Southern California Police Agency, went to Tennessee and flew HIMSS missions. And then he's now back with the Tennessee Highway Patrol. So back in law enforcement. So it's been awesome. It's been awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. I got to get Jeff on. To our listeners, if you haven't checked out my episode with Jack Shanley, episode 59 aired on January 16th, 2024. Again, it's episode 59. Check it out. Like Jon said, Jack is kind of a wealth of knowledge. And one of the cool things about that podcast, Jon, was I wasn't super familiar with like this TFO, the tactical flight officer position, which I'm sure we can dive into a little bit more today with you. But it sounds like Jack was like very familiar with that, was like the head TFO for LA for a long time. He taught new TFOs, and then he jumped into the pilot seat. So that was a really unique perspective, because I wasn't really familiar with that. How many episodes have you now released of the Hangar Z podcast?
Gosh, I think we're up to 170.
Wow.
100, yeah, somewhere right around there.
That's incredible. For people listening, to produce a podcast week in, week out, and do it consistently is tremendous. It's so much work. Even us guys that are on a smaller, niche market style podcast, we really try to work as hard as we can to produce awesome content for you, our listeners. And so for Jon to be able to do 170 episodes is insane. I think I'm coming up somewhere in the 80s, which has been awesome. I love it because of the consistency. I've totally seen my engagement go way up. I'm sure you're the same. And so thank you for that, because I think it's really important. I think that your podcast, my podcast, and the other podcasts on our platform, Vertical HeliCASTS, are all doing really cool things. I know that you're not supposed to like pick your favorite child. Happy Father's Day, by the way.
Thank you.
But if you had to kind of look back in the 170 episodes, what is like one episode that's really stood out to you? Maybe an episode that we could reference to if our guests haven't ever listened to the podcast. What would be a good podcast for them to come in and check you out?
Man, it's hard, like you said, to pick one because there's so much that goes into each episode. And generally what we like to do is profile our guest's background to kind of figure out how they got into the pilot seat. So when I think about, a lot of these stories, while we have similar paths in how we got to the pilot seat, a lot of us are very different. And we've all faced really adverse situations to get to those positions. So I spent a lot of time talking about that. And then each person I interview, I also profile the agency they work for and a little bit about the missions they do and try and go into some of the lessons learned type situations. So they're all, it's really hard to pick one out, but I will say there's an episode we did with RJ Garwood, and I'll have to get back with you on the episode number. Maybe producer Zach can help us out there.
Producer Zach, get to it, bro. RJ, find him.
It was in 2023, I believe, early 23. But RJ is a really good friend of mine. Unfortunately, he was in a crash on duty, flying for Huntington Beach Police Department. They service the city of Newport Beach Police Department, and they crashed right off the shore of Newport Beach. RJ was a pilot that day, and his TFO, Nick Vela, unfortunately passed as a result of that incident. But RJ talks about adversity. He talks about, what happened after the incident took place, what to expect as a pilot if you're involved in something like that, and then how to fight through some of the mental health side of things in the wake of that incident. And I think RJ took, a really horrific incident and made it really positive, as a result of, or he's trying to make it positive, trying to talk about improving industry as a result of what happened and not just dwelling on the bad side of things. So I really admire RJ for that. And that's an episode where I think there's a lot of lessons learned, again, whether it's, a post-crash incident, trying to understand, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my agency, what can I expect as far as the investigation goes? Is that something that most people don't ever go through, and you might have met somebody who's been through an incident like that at some point and gotten some information from them. But to hear it firsthand from RJ, it was obviously really emotional. Nick was a great guy and hard to lose someone like that. Nick and RJ were partners and friends. And so you can imagine the heartbreak that goes with a situation like that. But again, I think that's the one that I would pinpoint and be like, this is one you should probably listen to.
It's episode number 78 at the Hangar Z Podcast. Thank you to producer Zach for pulling that up. And yeah, that is an incredible episode. A lot to unpack in that episode, really, because it wasn't a very clean post-accident deal. And, RJ had to go through, and I don't know if he's still going through a lot of that, navigating that situation, but that was very tough. And then I can imagine some survivor's guilt and just everything that goes on top of it. It's like one thing to crash in a helicopter, then it's a whole level then to survive, but have your TFO and buddy perish.
Yep.
There's obviously a feeling of responsibility there. And then the way that it was handled by the department and kind of the investigation and the alienation and everything else that came from that, like talk about a shit sandwich. I don't really usually curse on it, but it really was.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd love to actually meet RJ. So he seems like a great guy, and that's a great episode. Again, it's episode 78. If you haven't checked out the Hangar Z podcast, you don't have to be involved in public aviation or public service aviation. One of the things I love about podcasting is even with my podcast, you don't even have to be in the helicopter industry. If you find helicopters fascinating, then you would find this podcast interesting and one step above what I do. If you're ever curious of what it would be like to be in law enforcement or public service aviation, maybe it's something that you're not going to do yourself, or it's not a career path that you thought of, then you can find a ton of value in the Hangar Z. Alan Mack was super cool. Razor 03, I actually just about 3/4 the way through that book.
Yeah, the book's amazing.
So that was really cool that you're able to, you've had some tremendous guests on. So congratulations to you and your success.
Thanks.
I'm just lucky to be on the same platform. How did that all happen with, MHM and you kind of coming on and creating the HeliCast? I remember talking to Mike Reno a few years back, and I had just done a couple episodes, and I told Mike, I said, look, I don't have any consistency yet, right? Let me prove a product and then we should talk. And then I proved a product. And then I remember it was like that year at Heli Expo, I'd been working real hard. And he's like, yeah, man, the Hangar Z podcast. I'm like, oh, who's the Hangar Z? I thought it was me. But then it turned into, hey, we're going to make this platform. It's not just going to be your podcast. It's going to be the Hangar Z. And Jon from the Hangar Z, you are going to be kind of on top of the platform. And at first, I would have to say I was like a little bit territorial, as one may be. I'm a high ego helicopter pilot, so don't blame me. But it's been amazing. Actually, you've been incredible, and you've been the right guy to lead the platform. But how did that all happen with MHM? Because I don't even really know that full backstory.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability, so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks to Mike Reno and MHM. They've been absolutely amazing. Mike. Their vision for the industry is amazing. I have to go way back to when I first got into public safety aviation. As a brand new TFO, I'd go into the hangar, and what would be on the coffee table was Vertical magazine. I think at the time it was Vertical 911. And I remember picking the magazine up, and I was captivated. I'm like, man, this is really good content. My unit supervisor at the time, there was like 3 magazines that he would leave out. One was Vertical, one was a magazine called Recoil. It was all on firearms and stuff, and I don't remember the third one was, but so there wasn't a big selection. He was very particular on what he left out. And so I'd find myself, if I had a little bit of downtime, trying to learn more about the industry, going through Vertical magazine. And we went to one of our national trade show, which is APSCON. It's our Airborne Public Safety Association. And we're at an after party, and I run into a guy by the name of Derek Cast. And he tells me he's from MHM Publishing or Vertical magazine. And I was starstruck. I'm like, oh man, here's this guy from this magazine that I look at all the time. It's super cool. So this is Phoenix in 2014. He gives me his business card. Fast forward to 2022, the end of 2022, talking to my friend Scott Dorkin, who is an amazing photographer. He did a lot of work with me when I worked in Ontario, covering our unit. He's done a lot of military aviation photography, really impressive stuff. And I knew that he knew Mike Reno. I'm like, hey, I'd really like to interview Mike Reno if that's possible. I know you know him. Could you intro us? So he sends out an email introducing us, and gosh, the rest is history, I guess. Mike and I hit it off. Mike's an amazing man. Again, business-wise, he's a genius, and he's also super nice. I feel like a lot of people in these high levels of business aren't relatable and have this kind of standoffish attitude, whereas Mike was very personable, very easy to get along with. And like I said, we hit it off right away. Not doing a podcast anymore to interview him. It turned into, how do we promote these podcasts that are promoting helicopter industry, and what does that look like? And it is kind of in creation of the Vertical HeliCASTS platform.
It's super cool. And I echo what you said. I mean, big shout out to the entire team at MHM, Mike, Linda, Derek, the whole editorial team, Dana and Oliver and Jen. I mean, there's just an incredible team, and that's been kind of the fun thing. And honestly, we haven't really accomplished everything that we want to accomplish on the HeliCASTS platform yet, which of course makes sense, right? We're not even a year into this now. I think we're maybe close to a year, but I don't think we're quite. I think we're just over about I don't know, 6-7 months. So there's so many fun things that we're going to do. And we're going to start, myself and Jon and Jason and Val, we're going to start working really closely with the editorial team, the editors of each individual magazine, me more specifically with Vertical, of course, and Oliver. Jon's going to be doing a lot more with Valor, of course. And we're trying to create a kind of this immersive experience where you can be on your tablet or your computer, or your iPhone, or whatever you're consuming your Vertical news. And you can be reading a story and then you can click a link and just jump right to the podcast. We've done it a few times on my show already. The Hill helicopter with Jason Hill is an example. And that was so cool, like to be able to read the article and then just click a button and go straight to the podcast. And so that's what we're trying to create for the audience. And that's what Mike Reno and the entire MHM team has always done. That really, I think, gives them such large market share in this industry, is they're always trying to create the best product for you, the consumer. And it takes ever evolving, right? It's, go from print magazine to only online. And then it goes from not just doing a magazine, but, having a social media presence, having a YouTube presence, now having a podcast presence, all these things that they're continually doing. So you, the consumer, have multi-level areas of content. So it's super cool. I agree with you too. I remember back in the day at Hillsborough Aviation, where I went to flight school, they always had the Vertical magazine on the tables there. Vertical actually came and did a photo shoot with Hillsborough Aviation. It was super cool. But I remember I was like line service at the time. I was like the guy that fueled, and I saw the photographer from a distance, and I'm like, Vertical. And so now today, to be in this position where I'm on the MHM team and doing a podcast and heavily connected with Mike and Derek and Linda, it's really kind of a full circle moment. To me, I think if you're connected with those people, it means that you've done something right. They've created such a strong brand within this industry that it almost felt like there wasn't people behind it. I don't know if that makes sense, but like Vertical is Vertical and Valor, it's just skies. It's such a big part of this business. It's great and wonderful all in the same time to know the people that have made it, made it so special.
Right.
And I think the HeliCAST platform we've kicked so much ass so early. I'm going to toot my horn. Why not? Proud of us. Proud of what we do.
Absolutely.
I think it's pretty cool, and it's a testament to you and all of us for committing to do this. And so, big shout out to those guys. So you're in law enforcement. Did you start as a ground guy? Just ironically enough, Jon, I got to say, I don't know like your entire story. So this would be kind of fun to learn more about you, how you started, how helicopters became a thing, and what that meant to you.
Yeah, so I started my career with the San Diego Police Department and lateraled after realizing I can't afford a house in San Diego. It's a beautiful place, and we want to get back there, but the cost of housing is insane, and the wages of a police officer for the city of San Diego wasn't going to cut it. So we realized if we were going to be able to buy a house, we were going to have to move, and we decided to move back to our hometown in the mountains of Southern California, where we grew up and our family still lived. So I lateraled to the Ontario Police Department, again, which is just outside of Los Angeles. Well, I have to go back a little bit because I'm a second generation police officer. My dad retired from the Anaheim Police Department, the home of Disneyland. And I remember as a kid going on a couple ride-alongs with him. Well, not just a couple, a lot. And I was always enamored by the helicopter. So there was 2 different times that I remember him getting me on a flight with it was Angel was the name of their helicopter. And I was enamored and hooked basically from the moment I got in that helicopter and saw what it did. So again, going forward to my time with Ontario, I get to Ontario, they have an aviation program, and San Diego did as well. They have a really, really great program. They're called ABLE. And both programs are very progressive, utilizing technology to its fullest to basically make the job the boys and girls are doing on the street more effective and efficient, trying to protect them and trying to make, crime fighting from the sky more effective. I thought going there to aviation was something that you had to have an extensive background, the military or elsewhere to get in there. So I spent about 10 years on the ground working patrol, did some investigations, promoted prior to going to aviation, which is a good thing because unfortunately in law enforcement aviation, most of the time, once you go to aviation, if you promote, you're getting pulled out. So if you're passionate about being in aviation, it's a difficult decision because you go up there and you want to work through the ranks of becoming a tactical flight officer and then becoming a pilot and then up from there. But again, if you promote within the department, oftentimes you're pulled out and sent back to patrol or to a different investigative assignment, and your odds of getting back to aviation are almost zero. So yeah, I got to work patrol. That was a lot of fun, a lot of funny stories, a lot of sad things too. Working the streets is a kind of a weird, gives you a weird insight into the underbelly of humanity. So you see a lot of pretty horrible things, but you see also a lot of funny things, and it was a lot of fun. But once I identified that I could go to aviation, my heart was set there, and that's the path I pursued.
Do you think this is something I've noticed is one thing, and I love law enforcement. I got to go on a ride along actually in Austin with my buddy Boone. We had a great time. Love the men and women that choose to serve. Like you said, I mean, look, you can serve in San Diego, you can't even live there, right?
Yeah.
It's like being a teacher, right? It's like a very unforgiving job and one that you can die at, and people do die at and risk their lives. And so that's a problem. I think that we need to do better. And I'm actually curious to hear your opinions on some of the other funding issues that are happening in other large agencies, including LA. But I find that you and Jack, my two really close connected law enforcement buddies, have a little bit of like a different demeanor than I'm used to with police officers, law enforcement agents. A little more lighthearted, a little more playful. Do you think that the fact that you stopped patrolling and you kind of went to the air unit and you were maybe away from the constant lies of people and the constant kind of BS of people trying to lie to you and mess with you and play games with you, do you think that actually made your law enforcement experience kind of ending in that area like a little bit easier? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think, what you're talking about is the time that you spend on the ground. I think you become hardened after, a certain amount of time. And going to aviation, I think it was a reset for me. You still are subject to, and you see the underside of humanity, but you see it in a different way. You're not touching the yuckiness of it. Essentially, you're helping the boys and girls do the job that are in uniform, and you're doing it in a different way. So I think, like you said, it kind of gets you away from dealing with the constant lies and the negativity that surrounds working the street. But having said that, working the street is so fun. It
looks fun. It looks scary. I remember I did the ride along with my buddy and like pulled over some pretty nefarious looking, vehicles and people that were up to no good. And, he's walking up to the car. I'm like, oh my God, like, please don't get shot. It's like very intense. It was nighttime. It was exhilarating. But one thing I've noticed, even with my buddy I was just talking about in Austin, and just experiences of like me and my run-ins with law, which have been minimal. I was actually arrested for armed robbery back in the day. So there's that case of mistaken identity.
Thank God. I was about to hang up.
Yeah. That was an interesting story for a different time. But obviously luckily I don't really break rules and do things, but I've had, law or traffic violations and things like that. The one thing that I find about law enforcement is sometimes like you can just tell that these guys and gals are so tired or they just maybe look at everyone as like they're being dishonest, and so that includes me. And I'm like, oh man, I'm a very honest person, like don't throw me in that loop, but I see it, right? Because they have to deal with just dishonesty all the time. People are lying. But it just seems like you and Jack specifically have a little bit of a different demeanor than I'm used to.
Yeah. And I think most people, their interaction with law enforcement is going to be on a traffic stop or, something to that level. And you don't see the lightheartedness of that person in that situation typically, right? Whereas if you get an opportunity to interact with law enforcement, in my experience, folks in law enforcement are generally super humble. And, just like in fire or any other public safety element, they've chosen to pick up a mission that's bigger than themselves, you know, and I always admire people that do that, whether it's 100%. The military or EMS or any other thing. To do something to sacrifice your safety for the benefit of someone you don't even know is a big deal. And I admire anybody that's willing to do that. So I think because of what you're talking about in law enforcement in particular, a lot of officers have this kind of guard they put up when they're on duty on a traffic stop or, you know, working an investigation of some sort. But outside of that, you know, I think officers typically are super humble and really fun people to be around. I appreciate your kind words about Jack and I. You know, he's a great guy. Brent Bundy is also part of the MHM team. He came from the Phoenix Police Department. He was a pilot there, and that guy's the same too. You know, super charismatic and just a great dude. So yeah, it's interesting to get your insight. You know, being an outsider,
just being a lonely law-breaking citizen that I am. Actually, a funny quick tangent, and then I want to hear more about your transitioning into aviation and things like that. But I was young, and I had a brash of traffic infractions, and I was always honest. Were you speeding? Yes, officer, I was. You know, and what would happen? I'd still get a ticket, right? So I was like, oh man, like honesty isn't working, right? And so I get pulled over. I'm actually a flight instructor at the time, and I'd been doing this. I don't know. I was volunteering at some kids event actually at the airport that day, and driving home, talking on my phone on the highway. And I look over to my left, and there's a Charger, an OSP, you know, Oregon State Police, right next to me. I'm like, shit. Slowly got to put my phone down. He puts on his brakes, comes up behind me, lights me up. And I had this old janky 4Runner, and the center console was broken, essentially, and I could pull out the whole plastic piece. And so I pulled that plastic piece out there as I'm getting pulled over, and I hid my phone in there, put it in there. And this guy, and he was like right off the bat. I mean, he was serious, dude. Younger guy, but serious. And maybe he was having a bad day or something, but he just wasn't taking anything. And he's like, I saw you on your phone. I'm like, no, I wasn't on my phone. You know, I had my hand rested here. I don't even have my phone. I've been at this volunteer thing all day for kids. Don't have my phone. And he's like, I saw your phone, blah, 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 blah. And it just was going on and on. Also, don't lie, but, you know, I was young, like 20. And all of a sudden, man, it's in this plastic piece. It's an iPhone. And he's just not happy. And all of a sudden, you hear this, and it's like echoing because it's touching plastic. And I'm like, all right, write me the ticket. And I got like 8 tickets that day. You know, I got he wrote every single ticket that he could for my vehicle. And so that was the one and only time that I chose to maybe not be fully honest, because I thought maybe, you know, I would get out of it. And I think the universe at that time said, no, dude, you should be honest. So
yeah, lesson learned.
I look back at that as like, I'm such an idiot, but it's so hilarious. Like, I knew the second that happened, my thought was like, this will be a funny story. Like, this is
someday, not today, but someday.
This is too good. And I'm an idiot. So no, I agree. I love law enforcement, and the role that aviators play within law enforcement is huge. We'll talk about that. So, but before we get there, you're on the ground. You had interest in helicopters. You had seen helicopters as a kid, but what did it actually look like to go from the ground to getting into the flight department? I know that each agency is different. Each department is different. So just speak specifically to you and your experience at Ontario, and then maybe share some of your other experiences with, you know, your podcast guests that have gone from ground to air and how that looked with their agency.
Thank you to our sponsor, Vertical Aviation International. With 80 years of service under our belts, the helicopter industry continues to innovate. We're growing with new aircraft and technology coming to the flight line and hangar. The industry's association is changing too. Helicopter Association International, or HAI, is now VAI, Vertical Aviation International. VAI unites the industry and advocates for you. Visit verticalavi.org/benefits to see how joining VAI connects you with your vertical community. Together, let's power up.
Yeah, so Ontario is unique, but also similar to a lot of agencies in that it's a the group of people that are at air support is very small as compared to the overall size of the department. Typically, you're looking at, less than 5% of the department's personnel is allocated to air support. So air support's one of those positions where once you get there, people love the assignment. They're usually really passionate about it and they don't want to leave. They're going to forego promotions and reassignments to stay in aviation throughout their whole career. So because of that, generally there's not many openings. If there's an opening, you're competing against some very qualified people to get there. So the people that are putting in for and going to air support typically, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, I'm promoting the other people that go, they're very high caliber, top tier police officers as it relates to law enforcement.
Wow, Jon, have some humility.
Not me. But so you've got to find a way to make yourself stand out from your competition, right? And so really, going back to my podcast and all the conversations we've had with people, our advice, the best advice we found, and this has come from multiple sources, is do the thing that you're doing now well. And that reputation you build doing whatever you're doing now well will precede you and help you get to that next point. And I think people try and make it really complicated and try and do something that's abnormal to make themselves a better candidate. And while it might make them stand out, really the most effective way is just doing the job you're doing now to the best of your ability. A lot of times that's patrol. Patrol is a backbone of most agencies, including the agency I work for. Our job is to respond to calls for service from the general public, whether that's a domestic violence call or a traffic accident or a homicide. That's what we spend our time doing. So get good at doing that, because that's what you're going to be assisting most of the units in calls for service when you're in the helicopter, right? So to understand what those requirements are on the ground will help you do the job better in the air. So again, going back to me, I promoted a corporal after about 9 years, and a corporal is kind of your first level line supervisor. Generally have training responsibilities to train new police officers. So get to that point, and an opportunity came up to put in for what's called a part-time tactical flight officer. So your job, once you get selected for that, is to go up and learn the roles and responsibilities of being a TFO and become familiar with operating on the helicopter. And if you do a decent enough job as a part-time guy, you get selected as a full-time TFO, assuming there's a position open. And that's, Jack talked about it at length in his conversation with you, but that's really probably the hardest job in law enforcement. There's so many different things that you're responsible for doing in a fraction of a second. Whether it's, operating the technology, the camera sensors, the radios, the light, the moving map, all the tools we use to do the job, that's all taking place at the time that you're, processing what you're seeing out the window and trying to navigate or help your partner navigate, who's the pilot. So there's just all these things, this multitasking going on, and humans aren't great at multitasking. We talk about it a lot, and that's, I think, what makes pilots somewhat unique, is that we're required to multitask in a lot of different areas. Doesn't matter if you're a public safety pilot or just a general aviation pilot, your multitasking skills have to be on point, or at least to the best of their ability, So it really is a difficult job, and it takes 2 to 4 years to become proficient doing that. So
I would guess watching a TFO, like a really good TFO in action, is almost like watching an interactive art, like someone just being so, like, I love watching people that are really locked in at what they're good at, right? Like, I'm really good at writing emails, right? That's really exciting for me, right? No, it's not at all. But to watch someone like a TFO or even a pilot just like bang it out and be so good, it's probably pretty fun to watch, huh?
Oh yeah, a good TFO, it's an art for sure. There's a lot of elements that go into that. Talking is a big part of it. I think about even in pilot training, what's most people's biggest fear is talking to the tower.
Yeah.
Coming from the field as a patrol officer, a lot of the time as a patrol officer, you're being encouraged to not use radio traffic. We have computers in the cars, and you can put you're on scene. You can push a button that says you're on scene. You can use your computer for most things. So a lot of officers are trying to stay off the radio. That way, if there's an emergency, an officer can get on the air and ask for help, or dispatch can put out calls for service, or whatever the thing might be. So the point is, you're trying to minimize the amount of time you're spending on the radio as a patrol officer, and you get to air support. Like, okay, well, now you get to use the radio as one of your primary tools. Our job is to paint a picture of what we're seeing to the units on the ground, and to give them tactical insight based on our knowledge and experience and everything we're seeing. So that was a big challenge. It's a really difficult part of that job.
Yeah, I'm sure. I want to fast forward a little bit just to make sure that we don't run out of time. What does it look like to actually then start the flight training within the police department?
For my agency, being a smaller agency, we had one CFI assigned to staff, but they didn't do the primary training. So we subcontracted with HeliStream out of Orange County.
Oh, yeah.
We fly to John Wayne Airport. Awesome program. A lot of public safety agencies are using them for their primary training and their recurrent training as well for EPs and whatnot. But they sent me out to HeliStream for my private and my commercial. Once I completed my commercial, came back and did all the advanced training in-house. So the CFI was then assigned to me and learned how to fly the A-Star. So obviously at HeliStream, you're flying the R-22, which was great. It taught you power management. All the lessons you learn flying the R-22 apply beyond that, right?
Of course.
Go to the 125 or the A-Star, and no longer are you shoulder to shoulder cramped inside of the cabin of an R-22. Now you've got this huge amount of space to work with. You can move your shoulders around. You got air conditioning and all the creature comforts you might want if you're working a mission. It was great. HeliStream was amazing, and then the advanced training was wonderful too. So it was awesome.
When you're doing the training at HeliStream, is that now your full-time job? Like you're not doing anything else except training?
Yeah. You're 40 hours a week.
Wow.
You're assigned to HeliStream. So, you break your flights up as they may be. And when you're not flying, you're studying. I went out there as a solo student. I didn't have any student mates or academy mates, whatever you might call them. And that was a little challenging because I'm used to being in academic environments where you can, study with somebody and help kind of process what you're going through with somebody else. And I was out there solo, which most people do, right? But everything, it's like drinking out of a fire hose when you're 40 hours a week flying and doing that part of the training. And I'm like, man, it'd be really nice if there was somebody else that I was going through this with, to bounce stuff off of and
Totally.
And just trying to figure out like, man, when you first start, I remember moments like, man, I don't know if I can do this. This is really difficult.
Yeah.
That first solo, and the instructor gets out, I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna kill myself right here.
Yeah, I remember my first solo. I mean, it's terrifying. I had one student one time. Watch the YouTube. If you're listening, come back, watch this so you can get the visual. But a student, really good student, I actually picked him up. There's my helicopter. I had picked this student up. I was a higher time instructor. I think it was the assistant chief at the time. And this poor guy had actually a hovering accident with his instructor. And they had hit the tail and spun and freaked him out.
Yeah.
And his fault, but not really, because the instructor really should have taken it over. The instructor let it go too far. So I get this guy, and I'm thinking he's going to be a horrible pilot or something. And he's great. He's a wonderful student. He's a good stick. He flies well. I do like 5 more lessons with him. I'm like, hey, dude, you ready to solo? And I don't have the video anymore, but I'm filming his first solo in our Charlie pattern. And I'm like, so-and-so's first solo. And he picks up. And the second he picks up, he does like 2 full rotations.
Oh, no.
Fast. And I'm like, you see the phone go down. I'm like just running towards the helicopter. Like I'm going to save it that way. Luckily, he unmesses it up and he lands. And I get in the cockpit with him. Like, dude, what was that? He's like, I don't know. So I'm like, let's solo another day. So it's, it could be a pretty nerve wracking time. How long did it take to go from private to commercial then?
I think it was about 4 months total.
Yeah. I mean, that's quick. It's
Yeah.
really fast.
Every day it's something new, and it was again drinking out of a fire hose. I'd leave and like, man, I'm trying to decompress and process all this stuff that I'm learning. It was challenging. It's probably, of all the sports I played and going to university and stuff, that was the most difficult thing I've ever accomplished by far. So
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard. I mean, people don't think about that, right? They don't realize all the ground, everything that you have to learn, and just everything that goes into being a pilot, the decision making, all that stuff. It's like, it's so foreign. You're learning a whole new language. on different aspects, on different things. So it's incredible. One thing I've always found interesting about law enforcement, and I can only attest it to kind of being similar to how we do CFIing here in the United States, with kind of the blind leading the blind, 200-hour CFI teaching new students. I've always found it a little bit crazy that a guy like yourself can do 4 months of helicopter training, get your commercial, go back to your unit, do your transition, advanced training, get in the A-Star, a big, powerful, awesome machine, but a big machine for a little baby pilot, admittedly, right? And then just start flying missions. I mean, that's intimidating. What is like the mentorship time look like to help new pilots really get their groove into safely operating? Because even though it's a far advanced aircraft and far superior than the R-22 with power, performance, you have bigger margin to kind of have some errors and things. But one would argue that it's almost too much for a young pilot to be able to grasp. So what was that like in those beginning, first couple 100 hours of flying law enforcement?
It was definitely a crawl, walk, run type scenario. So again, when I came back from my commercial rating, I was assigned to a CFI, and his job is to teach me how to fly that aircraft. So just like at Helistream, where you're flying patterns and you're doing basic helicopter operations, you're doing that in the A-Star. And then as you progress through your abilities, you add a little bit at a time. As far as what they're authorizing you to do, we didn't get checked out until 500 hours. At 500 hours, they do a proficiency check, and if you're good to go, you get authorized to be a mission qualified pilot. And a lot of that has to do with the insurance ratings for our agency. The insurance required 500 hours of time as a PIC before you were able to go fly missions by yourself.
So how did that work then? Because you would fly with another pilot then?
Yeah. So again, being in the A-Star, we had dual controls, and so you were assigned to a CFI to begin with, and then once you got past that initial stage with the CFI, you'd be put with a mentor pilot. Okay. And that mentor pilot's sitting left seat, acting as your mentor, but also working as a tactical flight officer until that mentor pilot and the CFI both agree that you've got the skills necessary to go with a non-rated pilot. And that's the challenge, right? Just like in HIMS, you're flying with people who are not pilots. So if there's an emergency, something happens, it's on you to take care of that situation. And you're responsible as a pilot for the well-being of those people too. So it's a big responsibility to have those crew members on board, knowing that you're responsible for their well-being.
Yeah, that's crazy. But honestly, more required training than I thought, and I'm happy to hear, because that's just crazy to me to think, hey, one day you're patrolling, the next 4 months later you're in an A-Star, right? Guys, a lot of the civilian guys don't get that first turbine opportunity for 1,000 hours, right, or more. And I kind of say that, in the civilian world, you pay your dues to get to the turbine. In the law enforcement world, you pay your dues because you have to be a patrol guy for, 2+ years, in your case, even longer.
You touch a lot of gross things, a lot of gross people. You do a lot of things that you never thought you'd have to do to end up in that seat. So yeah, you definitely sacrifice for it.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I think it's amazing and incredible. And if you're listening to this podcast right now, and you've kind of toiled this idea of law enforcement, really consider it, because law enforcement, there's kind of 2 things that are pretty awesome about it. 3 things, really. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but first and foremost, your training is usually paid for. So unlike a guy like me that did all civilian path, still paying off my debt today for my helicopter flight training. So that's super awesome to be able to have your training paid for. 2, you get to get into nicer equipment sooner, right? It took me 1,500 hours before I was flying like bigger aircraft in Robinson. And that's because I worked at the flight school longer. It was in my hometown. I was in management. I just had different things going on. So that was my path. But to be able to get into, bigger, more capable helicopters sooner is pretty awesome. And then I think the third thing is, unlike other commercial jobs, I'm sure there's some regularness to being a law enforcement pilot, some of the A to B or some common milk runs that you guys might do, but by and large, very mission specific. So every day you're probably doing something different.
Yeah.
And you're going to do something.
Right.
Air medical was kind of that way, but a lot of air medical for me was like going from the same hospital to the same hospital. And occasionally we would deviate, right? So I think that that's kind of the top 3 reasons to be a law enforcement pilot. And not to mention, you are providing a public service that's extremely necessary.
As always, a special thanks to Helicopter for producing this podcast. Specializing in helicopter evaluations, faster sales, and superb service, Helicopter is the go-to agency for clients expecting immediate results. Helicopter's team of helicopter professionals are the best in the business. Using their aviation expertise, a nationwide network, and a proprietary 76-step listing strategy, Helicopter will convert your listing from Mayday to payday. Ready to get started? Text Helicopter to 1-855-Helicopter. That's Helicopter to 1-855-735-5226. And a Helicopter pilot agent will reach out. Helicopter. List it, sell it, done.
Yeah, so I'll touch on the first point. You know, my agency did pay for my private and commercial. I think most agencies require you to have your private in hand before you start that process. I think they want to see if you have what it takes to get to that level and the dedication that you're going to stick with it, you know, because it is a challenging thing. I remember I did start my private rating, and I think I ended up with like 3 hours before I got selected as a TFO. But I went to a little flight school at Chino Airport in Southern California, and I chose the fixed wing route, obviously because of the cost. And I remember walking up to this Cessna, so unimpressed. You know, I wanted to be in helicopters, and here's this airplane, and I'm really just kind of looking at doing it as a way to be more qualified in my role and application as a TFO. Just so unimpressed, you know, by the airplane. And I know airplanes are great, but it speaks to my love for helicopters, right? Helicopters are so unique, can do these mission sets that are not as possible with airplanes. Patrolling's possible, but the search and rescue mission is definitely not. You know, think about like SWAT insertion, K9 insertion. Those aren't possible with airplanes either. So the helicopter just is this unique platform that we all get to operate in that does some really wild stuff. And it was great. So yeah, for most agencies, I think the private rating is where you're starting. And then you talk about the advanced aircraft. You know, most agencies are flying glass paneled 125s, you know, the 505s and what they're doing. All these platforms we're using in law enforcement aviation just have amazing capabilities. And it's been pretty cool to be a part of that. And like you said, pretty early on into the aviation career. One thing I will say that's fairly challenging being in law enforcement and then being a pilot is you're kind of required to be a master at 2 different crafts, 2 different professions. So obviously you've got to master the profession of being a police officer before you can get selected to aviation. And then once you're a pilot, you're no longer just a police officer. You're now subject to FAA regulations and all the things that go with being a pilot. So you're almost answering to 2 different bosses, right? The FAA and then your own chain of command. So it's challenging in that way. So definitely, if public safety aviation is something that your listeners are interested in, definitely give law enforcement a look. Obviously, law enforcement has to be a passion you have to go in the field and to do the job and to want to make that difference in that setting. But it's a really rewarding mission and mission set. I absolutely loved my time there.
Yeah, I've always been drawn to law enforcement personally. I don't know why I never really pursued it, to be honest. There's times where I thought about doing it, but then I was already kind of too deep, I felt like, in the flying career of like, oh man, it just seems like I'm going to lose all my, skill. And maybe, I looked heavily at Austin. Also, the application process is a bear, and I was like, oh, what? This is a lot, you know?
It is.
So, ultimately it just wasn't the path for me. I've often thought though, like, maybe I'll get my business to a point where I can maybe consider retiring early or selling or whatever, then becoming like a cop in the local area here, and like doing that as my second life, just something completely off the wall and way different than what I've done before. I'm sure you can speak to a lot of agencies, but I'm curious to hear with your agency specifically there in Ontario, how vital is the helicopter and how necessary are the helicopters to the law enforcement agency? I know right now, and this isn't a political statement, but obviously there's been a lot of push to defund law enforcement. And one of the easiest ways to defund, or one of the quickest ways to defund, would be to defund any type of aviation unit. Obviously, helicopters are super expensive, parts are expensive, fuel is expensive, insurance is expensive. So I understand from like a county or a city accounting perspective, if you're shaving a budget, the helicopter is certainly probably an easy thing to shave. But what is the detriment to the community if you take away that helicopter? How important is this machine to the actual department?
Yeah, it's a good question. We talk about this quite a bit in the podcast. A lot of agencies are at a risk for losing their programs when you got the financing department looking at the overall budget and seeing, hey, what's this big line item? So what we're encouraging folks to do, and I think we see it pretty broadly across the board, is aviation programs have branched out, and they're not just doing the law enforcement mission. They're partnering with the city and county agencies to do missions that are outside of the law enforcement mission itself. But interestingly enough, when it comes to just the law enforcement, I think 2020 and all the politics that have surrounded what's taken place, with George Floyd and everything since, has really highlighted law enforcement aviation's strengths. And I think it's become a great tool for law enforcement to accomplish some of the requests and demands that these anti-law enforcement crowd, I guess is a better way of saying it, what they're asking of law enforcement to do is challenging for the folks in the street. So air support's really stepped into a position to be able to help kind of accomplish a lot of that. You think about use of force scenarios, officer involved shootings. A lot of times those happen because of a surprise engagement, a pursuit. At the end of a pursuit, somebody hops out of a car and foot bails, and the officer takes off after him, go into an alley, and the person turns around and shoots the officer. Officer returns fire, and the suspect's down. Those types of situations are mitigated with law enforcement, because now as of air crew, driver hops out, you're keeping track of where that driver is, and you're setting a containment, and then you're calling that person out. And so you're potentially mitigating these use of force
100%.
Incidents, through that. And I think that's been great across the board, so it's a tough topic to discuss. It's really hard to pinpoint sometimes, what makes these programs so effective and efficient, because there's so much they're doing, but yeah, they've become, in my perspective, in my opinion, they've become a necessity for most cities.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you brought up, because I actually never looked at it from that angle. Obviously, the biggest discussion is the use of force, or maybe someone would even argue the unnecessary use of force. So specifically highlighted with like George Floyd and other incidents, of course. And look, there's bad dentists, there's bad doctors, and there's cops that aren't the best cops, and they don't represent law enforcement as a whole. And I think it's a great point, because it seems like the helicopter can maybe, like you said, mitigate a lot of those surprises. That guy's not going to pop out of the bush because you're telling your guys on the ground, hey, look, there's a guy in the bush right in front of you, 12 o'clock. Looks like he might have something in his hand, right? Like, it seems like that is a way to actually, like you said, decrease force. And I actually never thought about that as one positive of the helicopter, one positive of many. Obviously, I think, Jack had some staggering facts regarding the mission in LA. Obviously, LA having the largest aviation law enforcement unit, I think, right? I think that's a fact that
definitely one of the largest.
Brought up to me, and like everything that they do, the amount of stops or things that they're responsible for. So if you're listening to the podcast and you're in a community where there's a potential for defunding of the aviation unit or whatnot, talk to your local representatives. Support your fellow law enforcement, or support, maybe not your fellow, but support your local law enforcement agencies in providing them the necessary funding and tools to successfully and safely do their job. I think that if we start taking the aviation units away from these agencies, even in the smaller agencies, bad things are going to happen, and that's not good. And we don't want that to happen. So we all have a voice. We all have some bit of what we can say, specifically when it comes to elected officials. I don't think that this is a left or a right problem. I think that this is a human issue of, hey, helicopters are fantastic tools, for law enforcement. They're fantastic tools for so much. In fact, helicopters are responsible for so much of our infrastructure that the general population doesn't quite get. And if you're in a position where you can speak up and help save helicopters, specifically in the law enforcement realm, then I think you should. And I think we all have that duty. And, big thanks, of course, to guys like Jon and Jack, who I know personally, who have served not only as ground pounders, but also in the aviation units. Very thankless career being in law enforcement, and but very rewarding, I'm sure. And I know that you guys specifically, you and Jack and others that I know that have been in law enforcement, it's a brother or sisterhood type deal. I mean, you guys are tight.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the best parts of the job is it's about the person to the left and right of you, and those bonds are bonds that are forged in those environments. Hard to replicate those outside of there. So it's been great.
I did a off the record podcast. That's what I told Jack the other day. I had coffee with him, and I felt like I was doing a podcast with him because I was just asking so many questions, specifically about canines. Because he was a canine handler and trainer for a long time, and I'm so fascinated by dogs on everything. Your dog that can alert you to your diabetes. You have dogs are incredible, and the tool for law enforcement is awesome. So it was so fun to learn about that. To our listeners, you guys, we are the vertical HeliCAST platform that consists of the Hangar Z Podcast. That's with Jon Gray, who we're meeting with today. The Real Rescue with Jason Quinn, a.k.a. Quinny. He's rescue swimmer number 500. And then our newest edition is the Vertical MRO Podcast with Val. Val has extensive background in MRO, maintenance, repair, overhaul, if you're unfamiliar. They're going to be touching on a lot of really cool topics. They're going to be talking about ADs that come up. The aim for the MRO is to help educate and also give informative news updates when it comes to things like new ADs, ASBs, things like that. And of course, you have my podcast, the Helicopter Podcast. I think we're talking about maybe adding some other additions to the platform. So I think we're only going to become stronger. And really the guy that spurred all this was Jon. So Jon, thank you for creating this platform. And a big shout out to MHM, of course. To our listeners, thank you guys for continuing to support not just my podcast, but all the other podcasts on the platform. The way that MHM justifies this is by sponsorship. And it's been incredible. We have amazing sponsors. Bell and Robinson and PAG, Hillsborough Heli Academy, Helicopter, and so many others. And it's because of you, the listeners. So thank you guys for supporting our podcast. And if you haven't checked out the Hangar Z Podcast yet, I would encourage you to do so. 170 episodes. You have a lot of catch up to do if you're just starting. But Jon and his entire team do a great job. Jon, thank you so much for coming on, man. This is so fun.
Yeah, we'll say if you like the Helicopter Podcast, you'll like the Hangar Z much more.
It's true. It's true.
No,
it's
just kidding.
True.
To echo what you're saying, it's been an honor, a privilege to do this and to kind of spearhead this in the way that we have. You couldn't put a better group of folks together to make this happen. So thank you for your passion for the industry and what you're doing for the industry as a whole. It's awesome.
Yeah, thanks, man. This is so cool. The podcast is great, and the relationship with you and MHM is awesome. It's opened up so many doors. I've gotten to talk to some really awesome people, super cool people all through the industry. My podcast this year at Heli Expo kind of turned into what I call like the Helicopter C-Suite podcast with all the different OEM CEOs. Talk a little bit about a pressure cooker on that one. That was kind of intense, meeting with these people face to face and having
really
those
cool
conversations.
Yeah.
But, talk about an amazing experience. Like you, I just started this thing and didn't think it would do anything. So the fact that we're here is just awesome. Please stick around for a short moment to hear more from our sponsors. And again, thank you for supporting the Helicopter Podcast and the Vertical HeliCASTS as a platform. Jon, take care.
See ya.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com. Thank you to our sponsor, Vertical Aviation International. With 80 years of service under our belts, the helicopter industry continues to innovate. We're growing with new aircraft and technology coming to the flight line and hangar. The industry's association is changing too. Helicopter Association International, or HAI, is now VAI, Vertical Aviation International. VAI unites the industry and advocates for you. Visit verticalavi.org/benefits to see how joining VAI connects you with your vertical community. Together, let's power up.
As always, a special thanks to Helicopter for producing this podcast. Specializing in helicopter evaluations, faster sales, and superb service, Helicopter is the go-to agency for clients expecting immediate results. Helicopter's team of helicopter professionals are the best in the business. Using their aviation expertise, a nationwide network, and a proprietary 76-step listing strategy, Helicopter will convert your listing from Mayday to payday. Ready to get started? Text Helicopter to 1-855-Helicopter. That's Helicopter to 1-855-735-5226. And a Helicopter pilot agent will reach out. Helicopter. List it, sell it, done.